Hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ. Welcome to another CUGC Connect webinar. I think this is our first with Stratodesk, so I am very excited to welcome them to our webinar stage today. Going to be talking about their solutions for seamless remote workplace collaboration between Stratodesk and Citrix. And with so many of you guys still working remote and supporting remote workforces, I know that this is a very relevant topic today. But before we get started, just have a couple of updates for you. If you haven't checked out our events calendar, I hope you'll give it a look. We've got lots of local group meetings still happening all around the world. Next week is particularly busy, so check that out. We also have 2 of our Excel events. Those are our longer format. It's mostly an afternoon. 2 more events coming up, CUGC XL Southeast and Southwest. Those are technical sessions. We usually have a really great keynote speaker and lots of fun stuff in between, prizes, happy hour. They're really great events. We hope you can join us for those. And you know what? They're free. So hope you'll check out our events calendar. And if one of those lines up with your free time, we hope you'll join us. Also, if you have missed a webinar recently, I want to make sure you know that you can always go to our recordings library and check out our entire history of webinars. They go back to 2015. So you just have to be logged in with your CUGC account. And once you're logged in, you'll see the Files tab up there on the nav bar. Click on that, go to Webinar Recordings, and you have access to our full library of webinar recordings, including this one, which will be there tomorrow. But you'll also get an email with a link to this recording tomorrow as well. But anything you've missed, definitely go back and check it out. Okay, as I mentioned, we are recording today's webinar, and you're going to get an email from GoToWebinar tomorrow. It will have a link to this recording, and if there's any resources that need to be shared, we'll include those as well. Also, I want you to know you can submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation today. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but I want you to submit them as you have them so that you don't forget them. If they make sense during the presentation, we'll try to ask them. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end. And finally, at the end of the webinar, I'll have a link to a survey for you. It's short and anonymous, and it's for CUGC use only. Okay, so keeping an eye on all of your questions that I know you're going to ask is Martin Thurkelson. He is a CTP based in Denmark. Martin, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hello all. Hope you're going to enjoy the webinar. I'm working with Stratodesk usually as well, so keep your questions coming. I know they want to answer them.
Thank you, Martin. All right, and from Stratodesk, we have Nick Severson and Rich Severson. I'm going to hand them the screen in just a minute, but before I do, I have a couple more poll questions for you. Let's see, we just want to get a sense of what you guys are doing, what your needs are, and kind of how your environments are running. So first question, what's going to be most impactful, what's most impactful for your business right now? You can select more than one answer. So it looks like security is a top concern so far. Security, ease of use, and endpoint management, all 3 of those at the top are really important to you guys. Just give you a couple more seconds. All right, Nick and Rich, I'll share those results so you can see how that all shook down. Not sure if that's what you're expecting, but that's all right. And let's see, thinking about your work from home solution. So kind of what's going on with you guys right now. I know we've run a couple of polls in the last couple of webinars, and about 80% of you are still working remote. And I think last week I ran a poll to find out how many were going back to the office, how many were still at home or planning to stay home, and it was still kind of 50-50 that most people were going to stay remote with some time back in the office. So I think we're in this for a while.
Yeah, I did. I actually did a webinar several months ago, about 3 or 4 months ago, when this all started. And I suspect as we get towards the end of this, companies are going to discover that working from home is actually pretty successful once you get it figured out. And I think a lot of organizations are going to allow that to continue. So,
Wow, look at that. So that's a big split. So some people are happy, 41%, and 48%, no, they need a hybrid solution. So that's interesting. And then we'll run one more, and then I'm going to turn things over. So yes, Sarah, here, that's our other question here. How many of your users do you see returning to the office once the pandemic is over? And that's the big question, right? When is this going to be over? This one is spread a little more evenly. Let's see. Huh. I'll give you a couple more seconds. There we go. 3, 2, 1. Okay. And look at that. So a lot of you think that 75 to 100% of your users will be going back to the office, and those are interesting numbers. All right. Well, sorry.
That's really a keynote for me. Then I'll make sure that I cover the ease of doing that when we get into it. So.
Well, Nick and Rich, the floor is yours. I've just sent you guys the screen, so ready to dig in.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Stephanie, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're coming from, potentially even good evening. This is Nick over at Stratodesk. For those of you who are new for us here, a quick introduction to Stratodesk. You know, we are the fastest growing multi-architecture and computing or end user computing focused company in the world. We are also branching out and focusing on IoT as well. The way that we deliver that, of course, is with our NoTouch OS and the NoTouch Center, which here in just a few minutes, I'll hand it over to Rich and he'll kind of go through some of that for you guys. But I'm thinking that a good portion of you guys who have been attending different CUGCs and events are somewhat familiar with Stratodesk today. So we thought it would be kind of pertinent to do something a little bit different and just kind of highlight some of the new features that we've implemented this year, which may be more impactful for you guys' business. So that's kind of what I'm going to go through and talk about. And then, like I said, I'll hand it over to Rich, who will do more of the technical piece of things, which is probably really why you guys are all here anyway. So to get started here, we've implemented a new endpoint kind of solution here, which is the NoTouch GO. And effectively what this is an 8 gig USB drive that has our NoTouch OS pre-installed on it. And of course, you can buy that with a license or without if you already own our licensing. Just another way or layer of enabling, you know, remote work from home, kind of that BYOD solution where you can change the boot order of the device to boot from USB. And now you're launching and running the NoTouch OS while leveraging the existing hardware of the physical endpoint. Whether that be PC or you know, any kind of x86 based device, x64, 32-bit, 64-bit, ARM architecture, you know, we support everything in between there. So we've got that for you guys there. Likewise, another feature, which I believe for a lot of you guys could actually be quite impactful, is actually the Cascade update feature that we have, which is more of that peer-to-peer update side of things. So as you have different remote locations with multiple endpoints in those locations, instead of having different servers scattered throughout to be able to run your firmware updates and all those kind of things for the client OS image, you can actually pull that down the wire one time and you can point all the other on-prem devices towards that to pull down those updates, which kind of consolidates and streamlines the bandwidth. And then, of course, with security in mind and trying to manage all of those remote external users, we have implemented another feature, which we call our cloud extension. And realistically, what the cloud extension is, and Rich will go into a lot more detail on this here momentarily, but the cloud extension is basically a second virtual appliance that you stand up inside of your DMZ. So you have your primary NoTouch Center netted behind your firewall. You have the cloud extension sitting in your DMZ, and all of your external end users will be pointed to your cloud extension. There's a one-way SSH proxy that goes from your NoTouch Center behind your firewall to the cloud extension. And basically, that's how you manage all of your remote endpoints without poking a bunch of holes through your firewalls, and does not allow any external traffic to penetrate through the firewall as well while managing your endpoints. Likewise, on the subject of cloud, I know Citrix is doing a lot with Microsoft and Azure, and cloud is another big proponent for how you can manage your endpoints at home. We offer the NoTouch Center as it's a very lightweight OVA virtual appliance, which can be stood up on-prem or in the cloud, something you guys can host within your Citrix environment with Azure if you're doing Citrix Cloud. We can also do it with AWS, all of those kind of things. It's one of those that we can host it for you, or you guys can host it yourselves, or as the system integrator, you can host it for your customers. Likewise, we also have a new partnership and integration with Avaya for desktops, so that way we can actually start providing much more stable and improved performance when dealing with remote call center employees. So we just wanted to call out and kind of highlight that side of things for you. It would be the Avaya for desktop client. And expanding for ease of use and deployment, of course, with our OS and our company, we have various OEM agreements and partnerships out there, and we've recently entered an agreement with ATrust to where you guys can actually have another alternative for buying thin client hardwares with our OS pre-installed. ATrust focuses on x86-based endpoints, Raspberry Pi-based endpoints, all of those kind of things, which can all be managed in the same management appliance simultaneously. So you don't have to have different vendor management centers for different hardware versions. And ATrust is another great opportunity for us to be able to provide you some more diversity when looking for endpoints for your desktop refreshes. And kind of going into one of the last things we'll be looking at and talking about, as most of you are aware, Microsoft Teams is definitely a big component, and Citrix has done a fantastic job of developing in conjunction with Microsoft and implementing the Teams optimization. We do support that within our solution as well for x86-based hardware. Currently, there is no Teams optimization for the ARM chipset, but we're hoping to see that in the near term. No definite commitments on any side of the fence for sure, but that's something that we have today and where we're at. So anyone utilizing Teams, needing the Teams optimization, we can help and support that. And to round it up, guys, those are kind of the big key updates that I have for you. I'll be handing it over to Rich here in just a moment. If you guys have any additional questions, you'd like to go through a free trial, we do offer that through our website. You just go to stratodesk.com. Up at the very top, you'll see a free trial button. Go ahead and click that. You guys can sign up utilizing your company's email address, and that'll get you going. So real quick before I hand it over to Rich, are there any questions, anything you guys want to make sure gets covered during Rich's demo, anything like that?
Actually got one. Is NoTouch Cloud replacing the on-prem NoTouch Center?
Is NoTouch Cloud
Replacing.
NoTouch Cloud replacing NoTouch Center? No. NoTouch Cloud is the ability to have NoTouch Center in the cloud. We can either host that for you, you can host it yourself. Just depends on what their needs and requirements are. We actually have several customers that actually have their partners host NoTouch Center for them in the cloud. So. With everybody racing to the work from home thing, it was one of those things that a lot of people found that trying to get NoTouch Center stood up inside the infrastructure and get it through security, they just couldn't do it fast enough to be able to manage the users as they were going home. So we started hosting NoTouch Center in the cloud for different customers. So we can spin it up in just a couple of hours, provide the customers the URL, and they point the endpoints to the new management URL, and they have control of those devices. So. All right. And Nick, I don't see the option to present my screen, so
I'm going to share it with you right now.
All right. Let's see, show my screen. And it doesn't show, which one am I showing here?
I see the Statue of Liberty desktop.
All right, well, we'll go here then. How's that?
That's the one.
That's the one, all right. So again, as Nick pointed out, Stephanie and everybody, so thank you. We're gonna jump into the technical aspects of this. And like mentioned, please feel free to ask questions along the way. You can put those questions in and we'll get those addressed as we go. There's a lot of information about what NoTouch Center does. So just a quick recap, primarily Stratodesk, we have NoTouch OS, right, which is the endpoint that's developed by us, and it allows you to do take our OS and put it on any endpoint, whether it be x86, 32, 64-bit, and obviously the Pi devices. And it's designed specifically to enable VDI connection. So that's NoTouch OS itself, including obviously the NoTouch GOs. But most importantly, I think once you put those devices out there, the ability to manage those endpoint devices is probably the most important aspect of it, right? Because what if your users are having problems? What if they need assistance? What if you need to reconfigure them? All of those kinds of things. And the ability to do that, whether the devices are inside the infrastructure or netted behind somebody's private home firewall, the ability to manage those devices and control them is obviously the most important thing. So NoTouch Center, it is a virtual appliance. It takes probably 3, 4, or 5 minutes. Most people can spin up the NoTouch Center virtual appliance in just a few minutes. And it has two different interfaces. There's the interface for managing the endpoints themselves, which you see here, which is NoTouch Center. And then there's the virtual appliance side, which is what allows you to configure and manage the appliance itself. And so there's a couple of things that I like to point out when we're going through. So configuring the virtual appliance itself, there's lots of different options and configuration things. And the things to point out in here is obviously the appliance comes with a file store. So you can actually put files there such as, wallpapers, those kinds of things, even potentially different applications that you may want to be able to deliver out to the endpoints, firmware updates, those kinds of things can be applied to the file store for the virtual appliance. And then I like to point out that the NoTouch Center virtual appliance does include a Pixie server. So if you are using Pixie for your users, you have the ability to do that, including the option to do, Pixie Live Boot or Pixie Install. So we've actually had people using the Pixie server to do remote deployments of existing endpoint devices, where they just choose the option to have a Pixie boot install rather than a Pixie Live boot, and they can actually replace the operating system on those endpoints using Pixie. And interestingly enough, we've even had a customer use SCCM to push out the NoTouch OS with the install option. So they've converted, other devices right over to NoTouch OS remotely, and it's worked out really well. So then within additional configuration options within the virtual appliance, and I think one of the key ones is the host name. And this is really important in that if you're inside the infrastructure, you can simply set up a DNS A record for TCMGR, because anything that is running NoTouch OS on boot will try to resolve TCMGR. And if it can resolve TCMGR, it will automatically check into the management interface, and you'll have the ability to manage those devices with automatic discovery simply by having a DNS-A record, okay? You can also do email-based lookup for those that are outside of the infrastructure. So, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well, probably. Another thing to point out is the firewall configuration. We include all the information about the firewall configuration. So you can see the different ports and services. My firewall's going to argue with me here, but you can see all the different ports and services that are running on the firewall. So that again, this is for when the NoTouch Center is inside the infrastructure. So if you're not using Pixie, obviously you can turn off TFTP, those kinds of things. So it gives you a visual reference of what ports and services are running where, so that way you can manage the firewall. The cloud extension. Now this is one that has been real important this year. And basically, and I'm going to pull over another an article from our KB site because this points this out a little bit better. So basically, what the cloud extension does, or is so this is my instance of NoTouch Center that would be inside my data center, right? So me as the administrator running my, using my laptop with a browser or my workstation with a browser, I can then connect via the browser interface to the NoTouch Center, and I can manage those endpoints that are inside the infrastructure. I have full control of them, firmware updates, all the things that you would expect to be able to do. And that's nothing new to most people. What we did this year is we introduced the ability of the cloud extension. And the nice thing is it is the exact same software. It's just another instance of the same virtual appliance. So you stand that up in the virtual appliance, or stand that up in your DMZ, and you configure it as the cloud extension. And it's just a toggle switch and a SSH key. And as you see, what that does is that allows you to take those devices that are out in the wild, your home users, etc., and point them to the public interface of the cloud extension. And the only ports that you have to have open are 443 and 6667. And by the way, 6667 is only if you want to be able to do remote shadowing with those devices. And so what happens is those devices then report to the cloud extension, and then you as the administrator have the ability to connect to the cloud extension and through NoTouch Center. And the key thing here is to note that all of the traffic is over SSH via the API key outbound to the cloud extension. So it gives you full control of those devices that are out at the work from home without having to poke a bunch of holes through your firewall. So it prevents all the security things. And the nice thing about it is, as you note, all the traffic is inbound to the cloud extension, and then from the NoTouch Center out. And then, like I said, it gives you full control capability of those endpoint management, or those endpoint devices. So you can do the firmware updates, you can do the remote shadowing, you can do the reconfiguration, all the things that you would expect to be able to do, even if a device is natted in somebody's work from home environment. Okay. So, and realistically, like I said, it's simply you toggle on the cloud extension mode inside the virtual appliance configuration, and once you toggle that on, it asks you for the API key, and I'll show you where that is in just a minute. So it makes it something that's really simple to stand up and gives you the ability to reach out and have full control of those devices that are out in the wild, that are natted out in people's home environments, by simply standing up the same software that you're already comfortable with, toggling it to the cloud extension mode, and then adding the API key. And I'll show you where that API key is. So as I started talking at the beginning, right, there's two different interfaces to the virtual appliance. One is for configuring the appliance itself, and then the other interface, NoTouch Center, is what's actually used to manage the endpoint devices. And look at that. So there we go. So now I'm on the NoTouch Center interface. And regarding the API key, log in real quick. Like I said, when you're toggling on the cloud extension and it asks you for the API key, just go to the system settings, and you can scroll down and notice right here it asks for the gateway address for your cloud extension. And then there's the API key. You simply copy and paste that over into the cloud extension configuration. And then once you've done that, you can go up to resources, about, and you can scroll down and you will see that it says connected to cloud extension. So it's relatively easy to set it up. It's easy to determine that it's working, and once it's working, you have the ability to connect and manage those devices. So that's the key parts about the cloud extension. Okay. So
I got
now
a question that was put in here.
Sure.
They're asking if you can manage all your devices, internal and external, from the internal NoTouch Center. So that's kind of the point with it, that you just connecting them through it, right?
So you can manage all the devices, internal and external, without the cloud extension if that's what you want to do. You simply have to be cognizant of all the additional ports, certainly for the shadowing, the ability to do the firmware transfers, etc. So for security purposes, most people, and given the fact that how easy it is to stand up the cloud extension, most people prefer to use the cloud extension option. But you can do it either way.
But the cloud extension just adding to the internal sensor. So even though you're using the cloud extension, the clients will still show up in the internal run, right?
Yes, yes. It's all still managed through the same management plane.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Okay. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. Yeah. So it's still a single console. It's still a single interface. It just gives you the ability to have that additional reach, if you will. Okay. So now, next, let's talk about the automatic assignment and the discovery of devices, because this is one of those things that gets really important. As I mentioned earlier, the virtual appliance by default comes with a host name of TCMGR. And as I mentioned, all the devices by default will try to resolve TCMGR. And if those devices are able to resolve TCMGR, they will automatically report into the NoTouch Center. And once they report into NoTouch Center, they go into a group called unassigned. Well, that's nice. I now see the devices they have reported to the console. I can then go into the unassigned group, and if I wanted to, I could select the device and I could assign that device to a different group. But realistically, nobody's going to want to sit and monitor this, right? To see devices coming in. You know, has a device been turned on? Has it checked into the NoTouch Center? You know, based on its host name, you know, this doesn't tell me a whole lot about where it is, what role it is, who's going to be using it, those kinds of things. So there's not a lot of information here, if you will, to be able to provision those devices. But what you can do is you can have multiple groups within NoTouch Center. So in this case, I've got, you know, a My Devices group, I've got a staging group, and I've got a work from home group. And each one of these groups has the ability to have automatic assignment turned on. And then based on the automatic assignment policies, you have all of these different descriptors or capabilities of using to filter these devices to have them go into the automatic assignment group and go into groups. As example, for My Devices group here, I've got automatic assignment turned on that says that anything comes in with an IP address that matches this pattern, I want it to automatically go into the group called My Devices. Once that device goes into the group called My Devices, it will automatically get provisioned with the connections and parameters that are assigned to that group. So now, what I like to do at this point is I like to take a moment and pause, because a lot of people, when they first look at NoTouch Center, they go, there's a lot of buttons here. There's a lot of things. How do I know what I'm changing, what I'm administering? And the first thing I like to point out is the fact that it is an inheritance hierarchical model, meaning anything that I set at the group level is going to populate and go down to every device that's part of that group. And of course, you can have subgroups, and those settings will apply downward as well. Anything that is unchecked means it is either default or inherited. And I'll show you that right now. So as example, if we go here, you notice I've got, you know, the Citrix connection. And with the Citrix connection, because it is checked, it means that it is set at this level, okay? Now I can go down to different devices and I can look at the same Citrix connection, right? Because it's inheriting. It is unchecked, but that's because we're inheriting it, and we tell you where we're inheriting it from, okay? So don't let all the different buttons overwhelm you. In fact, the other thing that's important to point out is once you choose a connection type, you'll often get expanded options for that connection type. So as example, so let me show real quick here. What we'll do is we'll just go up and say new connection, and we'll just say test, because we're not going to give this any particular assignment. And as soon as I create that test connection, you notice it populates to all the other devices that are part of that group. I can then choose connection mode, and then you see all the different connection options that I have, including obviously Workspace App and Workspace Hub. So, and there's some really cool things about the Workspace App, and I'll show those in just a moment. But the fact that all these different connection options are there, and then once you choose them, you'll see that different features and functions come up according to them, so that it'll give you the extended or optional parameters for that specific connection type. So, and for this group, one of the things that I think that it's really important to point out, excuse me, regarding the Citrix Workspace app, is if you scroll down, and actually I'm just going to do a quick Control F and search for it. We're going to go to search for version. With the Citrix Workspace app, this is one of the really nice things that Stratodesk does with NoTouch OS, is the fact that we actually, as part of the firmware, we actually include multiple different variations of Workspace app. Because we found that that's really important, even if we include, in fact, actually we just last week released the 2009 version. I just haven't updated one of my images to include that yet, but we found that people may need to have different versions of the Workspace app simply because of the way that their environment is set up, different applications, different deliveries, etc. It's nice to get the latest software, but if you have to have a specific version of Workspace app to be compatible, you have the ability to choose that specific version if that's what you need to do, okay? It's also important to point out with the Citrix stuff that we have, all the HDX options are included, so you can enable all the different HDX parameters, et cetera, that you may need to reconfigure, including the webcam optimization and all those components. So everything is included for you to be able to do that. Now, once you've put and created those connections and have those configurations out to your different endpoints, and like I said, once I create it, it then populates out to the devices. I can go to the group, and I can right click and have all the different options to reboot the machines, power down the machines. So silly things such as send a text message where I may be wanting to assist a user, those kinds of things, if a user is asking for assistance. I can send a text message to say, hey, I need you to do something, etc. All those kinds of things, the information's there. Announce basically is our method, if you will, of telling a device that it needs to check in to the NoTouch Center to see if there are changes or updates. And by default, anything that is running NoTouch OS will do an announcement every 60 minutes. And of course, you can go ahead and change that if you need to, depending on your deployment. So let's say that now we've got the devices so that the devices are checking in. They've reported into my NoTouch Center, either based on the email or based on the DNS lookup. I've also got automatic assignment configured so that the devices will check into my NoTouch Center based on different parameters, properties, etc. I can assign those devices to different groups. Once they go into different groups, they get all their different connection parameters, including the potentially, VPNs, different security settings. You can actually change the host name of the devices. I mean, that's, I can go into networking and I can say that I want it to change host name based on different parameters. So I can say, the host name generation mode is the MAC address plus a prefix of NTD, or you could make that, WFH, so work from home. That way you can identify those devices rather quickly. Now, when it comes to identifying devices, et cetera, and providing different support, the things that I like to point out with that is NoTouch OS, the operating system that goes on the endpoints, has several pre-configured hotkey options. Example, Control-Alt-S displays all the system information on the on-screen display, meaning the host name, the MAC address, what version of software it's running, its management URL, all of that type of information is displayed on the screen. But as support people, or the people that are in the support center, when they're working with users, it's often difficult to say to a user, can you tell me your MAC address? Can you tell me your IP address? What's your host name? And typical users, we don't get those answers, at least answers that are meaningful to us. So one of the other hotkeys that NoTouch OS does is NoTouch OS has a hotkey that is Control-Alt-I, which sends an identify task. So I just did that to one of my endpoint devices. And I go to the identify task, and I see that device is now just shown up in the identify panel. I can then click on that device. I can now see all of the information about that device. I can see, when it last announced, was it reconfigured? I can see its host name, what version of software it's running, its MAC address, all the information that's pertinent to that device I now have visible to me, without having to ask the user to do anything except for press Control-Alt-I. So from a support perspective, that's really helpful. So now I can see all the information about that device. Now, let's say that I needed to be able to assist that user for whatever reason, like typical, like within the Citrix environment, we often see where somebody will say, well, I've got a USB webcam plugged into my device. And we as the Citrix administrators may need to know the vid-pid pair of that device to be able to forward that device. Or it could be, a pin pad or something like that, where you're trying to get diagnostic information to be able to determine, do I have the right USB policies to allow that device to come in? So what you can do is you can actually then, again, I've highlighted the device. I can click on web access. And what that does, that gives me the ability to open a web panel directly to that endpoint device, just as if I was sitting at the keyboard and mouse of that device. So I'm now connecting directly to the interface of the endpoint. I can see all the different configuration information. I can see the information about that device that we were just looking at in NoTouch Center just a moment ago. And again, going along the lines of the debug information for the USB, I can click on debug information. I can go to USB, and now I can see exactly what USB devices are connected to this physical machine. So again, if I was looking at, this is a Logitech keyboard, but if I was trying to assist this user with helping their webcam work, and they had some random generic webcam that I was unaware of, I could now see the vid-pid pair of that camera, and I could potentially make a USB exception policy to allow that vid-pid pair through. So it's really nice to be able to collect that information remotely, to be able to see it without having to ask the user to do anything. So now let's say that for whatever reason, I needed to get the logging data. I needed to get the configuration information of this machine. And I needed to be able to either send it to Stratodesk, or I needed to be able to look at it myself without bothering the user. Now, oftentimes, when we're doing remote assistance and those kinds of things, if we got to where we needed to get a log, we'd have to, potentially give the password to the user, right? Because depending on what the policy is. Or ask the user, hey, I need you to copy the screen and copy and paste and send that to me. All the different hoops as support people that we may have to do to be able to get that user to get the information to us. Well, one of the really nice things is I can click on support file, and now as you see, it says waiting. So what's happening is that endpoint right now is collecting all of that data. It's collecting the logging data. It's collecting the configuration information. It's collecting all the error reports, all the devices that were connected, USB, etc. And what it's going to do is that's going to generate a support file, and that's going to pull it to my local browser. So it's going to show up, as you just saw, it shows up in my download section of my machine, and I didn't have to ask the user to do anything, okay? Now, again, I am on that machine in the web interface, and I'm going to show you this because this is important next. So now what I'm going to do to that same machine is I'm going to remote shadow that machine, and you'll see that even though I'm on the web interface of that machine, I have zero impact to the user. And of course, we'll say connect, and I'm not impacting the user whatsoever. So it gives me the ability to see that screen and note that web interface is not open. And you notice in this case, I'm actually doing VNC connection. We call it no VNC because we're actually doing an SSH proxy tunnel. So I now have the ability to see that user's screen. I was able to collect that information and see all the information about that machine without impacting the user whatsoever. Okay? So those are some of the really nice built-in support features of what's built into NoTouch OS and NoTouch Center. Again, going back to the auto provisioning thing, you have the ability to have the devices automatically report to NoTouch Center, automatically get assigned to a group based on the automatic assignment policy, automatically get their connections, and provision those devices completely hands-off. So NoTouch Center with NoTouch OS gives you the ability to make the devices hands-off deployable. For those users that would be work from home users, obviously you can pre-provision the devices and send it to them, or they can actually use the email discovery method. But basically what happens is the first time a device boots up, if it cannot resolve TCMGR, it goes to a first-time wizard. And they have the option at that point to type in the management URL, or they could say my email address is myemaildomain.com, and then based on the MX record lookup, you could redirect them to the public URL of your cloud extension, and have those devices report in, and you have the ability to manage those devices from then. You know, all the things that you would expect to be able to do with endpoint management is built into NoTouch Center. You know, you have the ability to do firmware updates. So let's say that I need to update the firmware on a device, I could choose what version of firmware. And what's really nice about this is, to us, the firmware is simply an object, meaning I can roll back firmware just as easily as I roll forward, okay? So let's say that we pushed out a version of firmware and for whatever reason, we just determined that we needed to go back. I could simply choose an earlier version, select that version, tell it that I wanted to do it at announce or at reboot, and I could schedule the reboots for those jobs and then have the devices automatically pull their firmware updates.
Question about the firmware, actually.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a group setting, which is a location for one of your branch offices, and it has different types of devices, is there a way to push different firmwares to those devices based on the group and some settings?
Yes, so each group has the ability to have its own settings of firmware. You know, right here, you choose what version of firmware. So you could do that at the group level. Like I said, you could have subgroups. And what's really nice is NoTouch Center is actually intelligent enough within the group settings. You could actually say that I want it to be a specific version of firmware. And NoTouch Center, let's say that you had x86 devices and Pi devices. NoTouch Center is actually intelligent enough to send the right version of firmware to those endpoints. Okay.
Great. Yep.
So, so that reminds me of one of the things that I wanted to point out. So let's say that we actually had, this is how people moved from infrastructure users to home users. And likewise, going reverse, this is how you move people that are work from home back to inside the infrastructure. If, you know, there's multiple ways to do it. But as example, we had a very large customer that needed to move their users to work from home, you know, just as soon as possible. And so what we did is we worked with them to set up the cloud extension so that they had a public facing URL. And what they did is they went to their entire group of devices, so, you know, multiples of thousands of devices, and they chose the non-standard management URL. And instead of using the internal URL, they put in the URL for their cloud extension, right-clicked on the devices, set actions, announce that configuration change to all of the devices, then did an announcement in the buildings and told their users to pick up their machines and take them home. It was that easy. They took them home, they connected them to their network, they had the new management URL for the cloud extension, they reported into NoTouch Center, and they had the exact same level of control of them as they did when they were inside the infrastructure. Okay, so moving the devices to inside to outside is that easy. You could even do the same to move them to a cloud hosted instance of NoTouch Center, if you will, or vice versa, back and forth. It's simply changing the direction of the URL of where the device is going to be managed, and the device will report in, and you can have control of the device. While I take a breath a second, any other questions?
Yes. I actually have two different questions about certificates.
Okay.
So the first one is, how can we manage and deploy VPA2 enterprise certificates to multiple clients, and how to revoke them and renew them?
So, let's talk about certificates in general, and then we'll go to the WPA2. So with certificates, let's say that your storefront certificates, you could choose certificates and you can drag and drop the certificates in here, and they become available for the devices once the devices connect to be able to pull those certificates. And once you have certificates, obviously those are global certificates, but you may have machine specific certificates. So you could have machine level certificates, okay? And what we found with the WPA2, and a lot of people have been doing, is they'll do something similar to where they create a connection, and we actually support SCEP, which is Simple Certificate Enrollment Program, right? So then you create a SCEP connection, you point to the certmonger or the SCEP server, and the device can then connect to the SCEP server, request its certificate, download it to the individual device, and have that certificate available to them at the machine level. Okay.
Yeah. I think the other question was actually answered as well. It was how to deploy certificate to endpoints. That has always been challenging, but I'm guessing that's enterprise root, so on. That's what you actually showed that just before as well.
Yep. So, while you're looking at that, Martin, so one other thing that I'd like to point out, because this is probably the question I get most with Citrix people, is when they're configuring their storefront connections, people will say, well, our Windows devices connect to our storefront, but our NoTouch OS devices don't. And I would say probably 90% of the time, it's simply either a certificate issue or a storefront configuration issue, because obviously NoTouch OS, being Linux, uses the Linux workspace for app, so it gets routed through the storefront differently than what the Windows receiver does, or the Windows Workspace app. So what I tell people is try to use a native workspace app and see if you can connect to your storefront, your NetScaler URL to get your provision. If you're not getting connection, if you're getting a failure for whatever reason, try a browser connection, such as Chromium or Firefox, and see if that goes through. If that goes through, which I expect it usually will, that usually is indicative that there's a certificate problem between the Linux endpoint and the storefront configuration.
Great. We have one more question about installment. I'm not quite sure I actually understand the question, but now you're going to get it anyway. For install on a Windows device using the MSI file, when it reboots, it doesn't see the disks. But when you do it manually from an USB disk, it works without issues. So I'm not quite sure what the MSI file is doing, to be honest.
So that's probably a setting in the BIOS for the secure boot. So basically, one of the options with NoTouch OS is to do an install with an MSI file. And again, you can do the MSI option with the live boot or the MSI option with the install. So they would install, and depending on what the BIOS settings are, obviously for protection of the device, you may have BIOS settings that are preventing the secure boots or preventing access to the disk.
Okay, makes sense. Do we disable secure boot when doing the MSI install? Follow-up question from the same guy. So can it work with secure boot?
Depends on the BIOS, and I think there's actually the x64. I think the secure boot will actually prohibit you, but I believe you can put it into legacy mode, and that will allow you to do it. I would say definitely take a look at our KB site, because I know that that's called out on our KB site because we get asked that question quite a bit.
Yep.
So rather than having dead silence here for a minute, I'll let people think about additional questions. So I point out here that we have a staging group, because that's one of the things that we find a lot of people when they're talking about remote devices. What they do is they have them come into a staging group that gives them the ability to pre-configure, if you will, based on staging, and then give them either a host name or some other different piece of data that makes them identifiable to a group, such where you may have accounting or payroll or processing or manufacturing. So you can have them come into a staging group, and then based on that, you can then redirect them to another group where they'll get a different URL for the job tasking. From our URL pool, this gives you the ability to, like, let's say that I have global devices, and obviously I may not want devices from the Philippines or from India reaching all the way to the US to pull their firmware update. So I could actually have a NoTouch Center instance, or just a file repository instance of NoTouch Center sitting in a cloud host more in that geographic region, and then specify that URL pool, and the devices will be able to pull that from there rather than pulling it across the globe. Let's see.
And Rich, real quick, along the lines of staging, is that something, because I know we get asked this quite a bit, right? So would that be something you would recommend for, utilizing an import export for group setting feature, or maybe static or dynamic profiles?
So, so yes, I mean, so what Nick's referring to is actually this is something that we just introduced probably about a month ago, is the ability to do import and export. Because what we found is we found people where they may have their lab environments, et cetera, where they configure a group of, a group, like let's call the staging group. They configure that group, they get all the parameters and tests and everything's working the way that they want to. Now they want to be able to export those settings and then import them into a different group. So that's something that we recently introduced. And then static profiles and dynamic rules. So this is something we introduced earlier this year as well. And so think of static profiles as a reusable bucket of settings. So as example, I've created one, Espanol, where I may have a reusable bucket of settings, and those settings are to specify what keyboard language, what time zone, maybe a different URL, those kinds of things. And then what I can do is then I can go into those groups, and once I go into that group, I can actually specify that I want to use a static profile that is Espanol. And what it'll do is it'll take those settings and apply that to that group. So I don't have to completely rebuild those settings over and over, okay? And so the primary difference between static and dynamic is dynamic is enumerated every time a device reports in. So that may be something you only want to use for your mobile devices. Is it wireless? Is it inside the infrastructure? Because obviously using dynamic rules is going to put a little bit more of a workload on your NoTouch Center, because it has to enumerate everything every time a device checks in. Okay, so that's what those two functions are.
I have a question about the USB stuff that Nick talked about earlier. So is it possible to create a USB just on my own USB key at home and just test it out?
Yes, actually you can do that. So if you're not already using Stratodesk OS, you can simply go to our website, fill out the free trial form, and you will receive what's called the zip file. And inside that zip file, there's multiple files, including the MSI, et cetera. There's also a create USB utility that you can then create your own USB. And of course, that USB will give you the option to either do a live boot or an install. So you don't have to purchase NoTouch GO to be able to use a USB device. We simply made the NoTouch GO available because, again, with this mad race from home and suddenly the lack of hardware, we've had several customers that said, for us to ship, 500, 1,000 endpoints, whether they be laptops, other vendors, thin clients, what have you, to, let's say, the Philippines, can you imagine sending a pallet of thin clients to the Philippines overnight from the United States, the cost of that? Whereas opposed to take 500 USB sticks that are, approximately the size of your thumb, put it in a FedEx envelope, the cost is much less. They could distribute those and they were able to use the NoTouch GOs. But yes, you can create and use your own USB devices.
I had a question as well, if you could show the UI from the NoTouch OS. I did post a video for the guy asking, but if you have time, you can try and show that as well.
UI from the NoTouch OS?
Yes, so from the client side, you actually had the remote shadowing session.
Yep. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a Pi device, just so we go to something different and go to one that's a single display rather than dual display. So we'll get a little bit brighter view here. And you see we got the certificate error there, but there you go. And it looks like it's got a repeated connection. So we're going to go turn that connection off. We'll delete the connection real quick and announce. And while that's doing that, let's go to a different device here. Let's go, that one's dual display, I believe. Let's go back to this guy. There we go.
It should actually be finished already, because it's really, really fast actually doing these changes that you announced as well. So doing the configuration work is kind of a breeze.
And the thing to note of this, right? Again, it does say Pi Remote and it is work from home, and you notice it is on a different network. So I just reached through my cloud extension and reconfigured that device. And we all did it all real time.
So just to return to the firewall ports, what was actually needed from the client side to get in to the cloud extension, and then on from the client from the cloud extension and into the internal network? Can you scroll back to that picture?
Let me pull that back up here.
Just to return to all the security questions that we saw in the beginning that was on the focus of the minds. I can see Stephanie will also be joining in quite soon.
Yep. So if you're using the cloud extension to have full control, including remote shadowing, those are the ports that you need open from on the public interface to the cloud extension.
Yeah, and from the cloud extension, there's no ports open inwards to your internal network. That's only a TCP/22 outwards, right?
Yep.
Awesome. That should make the security teams pretty happy.
It really does. And like I said, I mean, this was something we introduced before the whole COVID-19 thing. And fortunately for us as a company, it couldn't have been timed any better because it's that easy to set up.
Yep. We actually got one more question here, and I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. But can you show the configuration of an example of Citrix session to hide the client OS? So actually hiding the NoTouch OS and just booting right into the Citrix login.
Yeah, actually, I didn't cover that because yes, it's relatively simple. So what you do is you would choose your connection mode, right? And what you would do is you would say automatically start on system boot. And take it a step even further, you could actually then say action after exit, so that if they close their connection, you could tell it to reboot, reconnect, or power off the machine. So what will happen in this case is it'll boot up, it will go to the desktop momentarily, it'll launch the Workspace app connection, the user would be presented with their login screen, they would enter their credentials, and then be presented with what the store has provisioned for them.
Exactly. We actually use that all the time at the exit code as well. So some of our healthcare just want to reboot so it's ready for the next one, and some of the private companies will have it power off to save on the electric bill.
Yep. And you know, given to talk about healthcare, and I should have mentioned it earlier, I didn't, but certainly under services, we obviously also provide support for Improvada. So you go into services, scroll down to Improvada, and you could turn on Improvada if somebody's using Improvada.
Yeah, we use that on several clients as well, healthcare wise. How are we on time, Stephanie? It's around the hour, I think.
Yep, we're right at the hour.
I think yeah, exactly. So if you got to,
right?
okay, if you want to take a couple more questions,
no,
and then we
there's
can...
a few more polls. Sorry, that was my bad.
Yeah, no, we do have one more poll that was wanted to run just really quickly. We didn't want to give you poll fatigue at the beginning of the webinar. Okay. Oh, it's kind of big, not too many big front runners here. Let's see. Give me just a few more seconds.
Certainly.
All right. Close that one out. I'll share the results for you. Can you see that, Rich and Nick?
I'm still seeing my screen, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think sometimes when I share the results, it depends on what screen you're looking at.
I can see it.
No, I can certainly see it as well.
Okay, good. And then there's just one more, and I think that I have to say, I'm launching it right now. What would you like to see in the next webinar? And I don't know how anyone could pick less PowerPoint, because this was a great example of a webinar that did lots of examples of being in the environment. It's great. And I'm going to throw in the chat for you while y'all are doing that. I'm going to throw your survey link. We'll close out this poll. Now, I don't know how you guys could say 79% less PowerPoint. Maybe you mean no PowerPoint at all. There were very few slides, people.
That's the simply remote click. Boom.
Well, I do have one more slide for you. Just to remind you, some of you may have opted in for a chance to win a pair of Amazon Echo Buds. I am going to run the attendee report after this webinar is done, and I'm going to use the Google randomizer to select the winner, and we will announce that winner out on Twitter. So be sure to follow us on Twitter at myCUGC so that you know. Also, that's just a great place to keep up with everything that CUGC is doing. We try to tweet everything out as we know it, so be sure to follow us there. And also make sure you come on out to mycugc.org and check out our events calendar. But there's more than that. There are discussion forums. You can ask questions. You can answer questions because you can also help other people out when they have problems. You can check in with your local group. If you haven't joined a local group, go find yours and join today. And then also, like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, you can find all the latest webinar recordings, and we have lots of technical blogs, even one recently from our friend Martin here about an upcoming Citrix Converge 2020. So if you want to know what that is, go to mycugc.org, and his blog is on the homepage. Go read it. All right, and with that, I think I'm going to return everyone to their day. Thank you so much, Rick and sorry, I combined your names, Rich and Nick. I mean, you have the same last name. But thanks, guys, for being with us today. It was a great webinar and great demonstration of everything that Stratodesk has for us.
Absolutely, and thank you, Stephanie and Martin, for having us. We look forward to doing this again with you guys, next available, of course. And thank you for everyone who joined and participated. We really appreciated all the questions and your feedback.
All right, and thank you. I want to thank Martin myself. Thanks, Martin, because I know it's late in the day for you over in Denmark, so appreciate you being with us today and keeping an eye on the questions.
It's always good fun, so happy to help out.
All right, everyone. I hope you all stay happy and healthy and safe, and we will see you at another CUGC event again soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.